In the heart of New York City, the night carried the usual hum of activity, the rumble of taxis, the sharp click of high heels against the pavement, and the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the polished glass towers. At the corner of 5th Avenue and 54th, a distinguished elderly man named James Wright stood outside an upscale restaurant, his calm demeanor belying the weight of the years he had lived. His gray hair was neatly combed, his tailored coat immaculately pressed, and his presence unmistakably dignified. He was, after all, a retired Supreme Court justice. James had arrived a few minutes early to meet his granddaughter, Claire, who was attending a dinner inside with some colleagues from Columbia Law School. He had politely declined the invitation, preferring instead to wait outside, allowing her to navigate the world of legal ambition on her own. It was a habit he had developed over the years, being early, taking a moment to gather his thoughts, rather than rushing into things. As he watched the luxury cars pull up to the valet and the well-dressed pedestrians passing by, he couldn't help but appreciate the anonymity that the city had afforded him since his retirement. The occasional glance from a passerby, the slight recognition in their eyes, he preferred it this way. His life in the public eye had been long enough. Across the street, a police squad car sat idling at the curb. Inside, officers William "Billy" Dorsey and Brian Hill observed James. Their conversation had long since tapered off, and their eyes were now trained on the elderly man standing across the street. Dorsey, younger and brash, tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on James. "Look at this guy," Dorsey muttered, an amused smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "Shouldn't be standing around here like he owns the place." Hill, the older and more methodical of the two, leaned back in his seat with a sigh. "I bet he's waiting to ask someone for money, hanging around these high-end restaurants." Dorsey chuckled and pushed open his door. "Let's see if we can move him along. He's making the area look bad." The two officers crossed the street with the purposeful stride of men accustomed to getting their way without question. James didn't flinch when he heard the approaching footsteps. He didn't turn either, but his sharp, quiet awareness was unshaken as the officers stopped before him. Dorsey's voice rang out, thick with authority, but lacking the depth of real power. "Sir, we need you to move along," he said, his tone dismissive. James didn't react immediately, inhaling slowly as he considered his next move. He had dealt with people like these officers countless times over the years. Those who presumed their authority came with an inherent right to belittle. He knew they wouldn't understand, and that was the whole point. After a long silence, James looked up, his voice calm, measured, and unwavering. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he replied, his eyes meeting Dorsey's with unblinking clarity. Dorsey raised an eyebrow and let out a derisive chuckle. "Yeah? Well, you've been standing here for a while, and we've had complaints about suspicious activity." He dragged the words out like a man humoring a child's excuse. "Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this." James, maintaining the same composed expression, spoke again, the words rolling off his tongue with steady precision. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated, his tone flat, showing neither curiosity nor concern. Hill, standing behind Dorsey, let out a low exhale, barely hiding his impatience. "Just move along, all right?" "We're not asking twice." James remained still. His expression never wavered, but he took his time, reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing his wallet. "I assume you'd like to see my identification," he said calmly, holding the wallet out. There was a flicker of hesitation, a slight shift in Hill's stance, but only for a moment. Then, without warning, Dorsey reached out, slapping the wallet out of James's hand. The wallet hit the pavement with a dull thud, spilling out a few neatly stacked bills and several identification cards. James didn't flinch. He stood there, as still as stone, and for the first time, a subtle shift appeared in his expression, something deeper than mere silence. He didn't look at the wallet that lay on the pavement, nor did he give attention to the officer's smug expressions. Instead, he let the weight of the moment hang in the air. Hill stepped forward, placing his boot on the wallet and pressing it into the pavement. "Didn't ask for your ID," he muttered with a sneer. Dorsey chuckled darkly, his grip tightening around his baton as he watched James. "Got a problem with following directions, old man?" James's gaze remained locked on Hill, unwavering. He did not respond in anger, but his eyes conveyed something far more powerful. Quiet confidence, the kind that only years of experience could cultivate. "You are making a mistake," James said, his voice cool and deliberate. Hill leaned in slightly, his voice low as he smirked. "Yeah? And what exactly do you think is going to happen here?" James's gaze never wavered, and his lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "You're going to find out," he said calmly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of certainty that neither officer understood. The officers were waiting for a reaction, expecting him to break, to give them something to use against him. But James had spent a lifetime understanding how to handle people who mistook power for righteousness. His silence was far more potent than any words they could twist into justification. Dorsey pressed harder on the wallet with his boot, trying to provoke James, but the elderly man remained steadfast, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. There was no anger, no fear, only the quiet certainty of a man who knew the truth would come to light. "You're not hearing us, old man," Hill growled, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've got about 3 seconds to start walking before we make you." James didn't flinch. "I have told you already," he said, his voice even and deliberate. "I am waiting for my granddaughter. I am standing on a public sidewalk. You have no legal grounds to remove me." Dorsey's smirk faltered for a brief moment, and Hill stiffened as the weight of James's words began to settle in. They had already decided how this would end, but James wasn't about to make it easy for them. The tension in the air grew thick as both officers stood in front of him, waiting for something, anything, that would allow them to justify their actions. But James remained perfectly still, his eyes unblinking, unwavering. He wasn't just any man on the street. He was a man who had fought in courtrooms for justice for decades, and he would not let these men dismiss him so easily. And so, the battle began, not in the form of shouting or resistance, but in the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who had nothing to prove, yet everything to lose. The two officers stood before James Wright, each of them still unwilling to acknowledge the depth of the mistake they had just made. Dorsey, the younger officer, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly annoyed that James wasn't reacting the way he had expected. Hill, the older officer, was a little more restrained, but his patience was starting to wear thin. Neither of them realized just how deeply they had overestimated their own authority, nor how little they understood the man they were dealing with. "Look," Dorsey began, his voice laced with an impatience he couldn't quite hide. "We don't have time for this. You've been standing here long enough, and you're making people nervous." His tone was dismissive, but there was an edge of something darker beneath it, a threat that lingered in the space between his words. "If you're not doing anything wrong, then just move along." James took a moment before responding, as though considering the absurdity of the request. He could feel the weight of their presumption pressing down on him, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath. His mind, trained to navigate the complexities of law and rights, already knew how this encounter was going to play out, at least in the long run. "Again," James said, his voice calm, but the authority in it unmistakable. "I am waiting for my granddaughter. I've told you that already." Dorsey rolled his eyes, shaking his head as though James were a child making excuses. "Yeah, right," he muttered under his breath. "We're getting complaints, and you think you can just stand here all night? It doesn't work like that." Hill exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he turned to his partner, trying to mask the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He had been on the force long enough to know how these situations played out, but even he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. His gut told him they were making a mistake, but his pride and Dorsey's youthful enthusiasm pushed him to ignore it. James stood tall, unyielding, his posture straight. He didn't look at the officers' faces, didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting to their jeers. Instead, his gaze remained focused ahead, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, waiting, calm and composed. The city was alive, bustling, and the officers were right in assuming that James was a stranger in this corner of it. But what they failed to see was that James wasn't a stranger at all. He had simply learned how to exist beyond their narrow understanding of the world. The fact that they didn't know who he was didn't matter. In fact, it was exactly what he wanted. Hill took another step forward, his face growing hard, the lines of his uniform stiff with the weight of his assumed power. "Listen, old man," he snapped, stepping into James's space. "If you don't want this to go any further, you need to move along. We're not asking again." James's eyes flicked toward Hill, a slight shift in his posture that suggested a sudden tension in the air. His voice, however, remained as even as ever. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, the calm assurance of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. For a moment, the officers were silent. It wasn't the response they expected, and it made them uneasy. But Dorsey, ever the brash one, didn't let the unease show. He stepped forward and grabbed James by the arm with more force than was necessary. His grip tightened, a silent message that he believed he was in control of the situation. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. "You're coming with us." James didn't fight back. He didn't need to. The moment Dorsey's hand touched his arm, James felt the familiar chill of certainty in his veins. He had been in situations like this before, many times in fact. His resolve, honed by years of dealing with men who thought they held power, was unshakable. "You are making a mistake," James repeated, his tone not rising, not breaking. The words were the same as before, but they carried more weight now. Dorsey's face twisted in disbelief, but his arrogance couldn't allow him to back down. "A mistake," he laughed, his grip tightening on James's arm. "You're the one making a mistake by not listening?" James's voice didn't waver. "No," he said softly, his gaze not leaving Dorsey's. "The mistake is yours." Hill, now feeling the first stirrings of doubt, glanced over at Dorsey. There was a slight hesitation in his eyes, but it was fleeting. The younger officer, caught in his own sense of authority, brushed it off. Hill exhaled sharply, pushing the nagging feeling down into the pit of his stomach. Without warning, Dorsey yanked James's arm, forcing him to turn around and start walking toward the squad car. James moved slowly, deliberately, never once breaking stride. As they reached the vehicle, Dorsey roughly shoved James into the back seat, his hand on the elderly man's shoulder, guiding him with unnecessary force. But as the door slammed shut behind him, James remained composed. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't need to. In that moment, he knew something they didn't. He wasn't a helpless old man caught in a system of injustice. He was a man who had watched this system break down countless times before, and he knew how to dismantle it. Inside the precinct, the officers went through the motions of processing James. There was no hurry, no concern for the elderly man they had just detained. They were convinced this was just another routine arrest, just another loiterer they would be rid of by the end of their shift. But James had already set the wheels of something far larger in motion. He sat in the holding cell, his hands resting lightly on his lap, waiting. He knew what was coming next. The officers didn't. Outside, Claire arrived at the precinct, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floors. The moment she entered, she saw the indifference on the officers' faces. They had no idea who she was, but they would soon learn. Her eyes immediately found her grandfather, sitting still in the cell, as calm as ever. The sight of him, detained, humiliated, ignited a fire in her chest. She stepped forward, determined to right this wrong, but she wasn't naive enough to think it would be that easy. "Let him go," she demanded, her voice sharp with anger. The officer standing at the desk barely glanced up at her. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," he muttered dismissively, not even bothering to meet her gaze. Claire stepped closer, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of her resolve. "You don't understand," she said, eyes narrowing as she pulled out her phone. "This man is James Wright. He's a retired Supreme Court justice. Do you understand what you're doing right now?" There was a brief flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a sneer. "Justice Wright, huh?" Dorsey said with a mock laugh. "Guess he's just playing some game, huh?" Claire didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke again, her voice carrying an unyielding authority. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said coldly. "I'm telling you, this man doesn't belong in a holding cell." Inside the small, dimly lit holding cell, James Wright sat as if time had paused around him. The sounds of the precinct, the muffled chatter of officers, the scraping of papers, the occasional ringing of phones, seemed distant, as though he were removed from the chaos around him. His posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, hands resting calmly in his lap. and the stillness around him was both a shield and a weapon. There was no fear in his expression, only the quiet assurance of a man who had seen enough to understand that all things, no matter how long they took, would eventually come to an end. The door to his cell clanged open, and one of the officers, Dorsey, if James had correctly memorized the young man's name, approached, his face contorted with the arrogance of someone who thought he held the upper hand. "You know," Dorsey sneered, his voice loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear, "you're lucky we didn't haul you off somewhere else. We could have made this a lot worse for you, old man." James didn't respond, his eyes never leaving the officer's face, but his calm presence made Dorsey's words seem hollow. He could see the young officer was growing impatient with the lack of reaction, but James didn't mind. It was part of the game, waiting for the right moment, letting the tide of arrogance wash over them, and then calmly stepping into the opening once it presented itself. Dorsey stood there for a moment, his fingers tapping nervously on the metal bars of the cell. He was still expecting some kind of defiance, some flash of anger, something to justify the control he was exercising. But James only leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he saw Dorsey's growing unease. "I need to make a phone call," James said finally, his voice steady, his words measured. Dorsey looked at him like he was hearing a strange request, as though the idea that an elderly man who had been detained for no reason could possibly have any rights was beyond him. "Yeah, sure, you can make your phone call, but I'll decide when." James didn't respond immediately, letting the officer's words hang in the air. After a beat, he spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "I will be making my phone call now," he said, the last word firm and final. Dorsey hesitated, his face flickering with uncertainty, but he had been taught to follow protocol, and he did not question his orders. "Fine," he muttered before turning to the desk officer a few steps away. "Get him a phone." Moments later, the phone was handed to James. He took it in his hand, his fingers wrapping around the receiver with the same quiet precision he had practiced in countless courtrooms. He dialed a number, the rhythm of the numbers pressed against his palm filling the silence of the holding area. After 2 rings, a voice answered, a voice that was as crisp and clear as the sound of a gavel striking the bench. "Yes?" The voice on the other end was familiar, its calm authority unmistakable. James allowed a brief pause before responding. "Alan, it's James," he said, his voice as smooth as glass. "I need you to listen very carefully." There was a slight intake of breath on the other end of the line, a brief, sharp exhale, as though the other person knew the gravity of the moment. "James," Alan Whitmore, the Chief Justice of the United States, responded after a beat, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What's happened?" "I've been arrested," James replied evenly, his words carrying the weight of years spent in the halls of justice. "I was detained outside the Hamilton restaurant. 2 officers, Dorsey and Hill, arrested me without checking my identification. They made assumptions about me, and they are treating me like a criminal." The silence on the other end was palpable, and for a moment, James let it stretch. He didn't need to say anything else. Alan knew who James was, knew the significance of his words, and that was all that mattered. "James, are you okay?" Alan's voice, now tinged with concern, cracked through the tension. "I'm fine," James replied, his voice unwavering. "But I need you to act quickly. They are making a grave mistake." Alan's sigh came through the receiver, long and heavy. James could hear him adjusting in his chair, the subtle sound of paper shuffling as his mind began to process the situation. It was clear now that Alan had recognized the severity of what had occurred. "Stay where you are," Alan said after a long pause, his tone now clipped with professional resolve. "I'll make some calls." The line went silent for a few seconds, and James could practically hear Alan's thoughts moving quickly, calculating the next steps. Alan had been a friend, a colleague, but he was also a man of action, someone who knew exactly how to use his position to influence the course of events. James wasn't worried. He knew that whatever came next, the wheels of justice would begin to turn in his favor. The phone clicked back to life in his hand as Alan continued. "I'm sending someone to handle this, James. Stay calm. This isn't over," Alan said, his voice firm but filled with quiet urgency. "I'll make sure this gets resolved, but you need to hold on. Don't say anything else to them." "I won't," James assured him, his voice unwavering. "But they've made a mistake, and they will regret it." The conversation ended as the line clicked dead, and James set the receiver back into its cradle with the same quiet deliberation. He sat back in his chair, his hands folded together, his posture unbroken. His mind was already working through the next steps, the necessary actions that would follow once the truth came to light. Outside his cell, the officers went about their duties, unaware that the moment they had just thought was a small victory, one that would end with the elderly man being forgotten in the system, had instead set the stage for a far more consequential outcome. They were blind to the storm that was brewing just outside their walls. The precinct buzzed with a lazy hum as the night drifted on. Officers sat at their desks, nursing cups of stale coffee, chatting idly about the mundane events of the day. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards and the occasional shuffle of papers filled the air. It was the kind of late-night routine that lulled people into a false sense of security. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened at this hour. And then the door opened. Claire Wright strode through the entrance with a sense of purpose that immediately cut through the sluggish atmosphere. The click of her heels against the tile floor was sharp, deliberate, and commanding, as though each step carried the weight of her determination. Her professional attire, a crisp blazer and a tailored skirt, was impeccable, but it was her presence that truly marked her as someone not to be ignored. She wasn't here to play by the usual rules. She wasn't here to ask questions. She was here to take control of a situation that had already gone terribly wrong. As she walked deeper into the precinct, her eyes scanned the room, quickly finding the source of her anger. Her grandfather, James, was sitting quietly in a holding cell, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his posture as dignified as ever. The sight of him, detained like some common criminal, sparked an immediate fury in Claire. The quiet assurance in his face only deepened her resolve. He wasn't just a man caught up in a system gone awry. He was a symbol of everything wrong with it. And now it was time to right this wrong. She approached the desk where Officer Dorsey was sitting, his back to her as he flipped through a set of files. Claire's voice, cold and sharp, sliced through the air like a blade. "Let him go," she demanded, her words hanging in the air with a quiet fury. Dorsey turned, a look of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected anyone like Claire, professional, poised, and undeniably powerful, to be walking through his doors. The moment he met her eyes, something in his stomach tightened. He didn't know who she was yet, but he could tell that this was no ordinary request. "Ma'am," Dorsey began, his voice still carrying that casual dismissiveness, "we're just doing our job here. Your grandfather was detained for loitering." Claire's eyes flashed with a cold anger. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention from the officers nearby. "My grandfather was arrested for no reason," she said, her voice laced with authority. "He was standing outside the restaurant waiting for me, and you had no right to detain him." Dorsey glanced around, clearly uncomfortable under her unwavering gaze. He wasn't used to being confronted so directly. His face hardened slightly, but he still didn't seem to fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. "Look," he began again, his tone condescending, "you should really take this up with your lawyer. We have procedures to follow." Claire's jaw clenched as she took another step toward him, her eyes narrowing with growing frustration. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up for him to see. The screen displayed her grandfather's name, James Wright, clearly visible in the contact information. She didn't need to say another word. "This man is a retired Supreme Court justice," Claire stated, her voice steady but filled with a sharp urgency, "and you just arrested him for no reason." Dorsey's eyes flickered briefly with recognition, but the realization that he had just made a massive mistake hadn't fully sunk in yet. He scoffed, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Yeah, sure, lady. I'm sure he's got a lot of important titles. But right now, he's just another person we need to process. You want to bail him out? Go ahead." Claire's temper flared, but she kept her composure, taking a step back, her eyes never leaving Dorsey's face. Her heart was racing, and the heat of the moment was pressing against her chest. But she knew that she couldn't let her emotions get the better of her. She had to be smarter than that. "I'm telling you," Claire said, her voice dropping, "you don't understand what you've done. Do you know who you're dealing with? This man shaped civil rights law in this country, and you arrested him like he was some criminal. Dorsey's bravado was beginning to crack, but he still held his ground. "I don't care who he is. People like him think they can just do whatever they want, act like they're above everyone else." At that, Claire's patience finally snapped. She leaned forward, her voice low but filled with the force of a prosecutor making a point before a jury. "You don't get it," she said. "This man isn't above anyone. He's a symbol of justice. And right now, you're about to learn that this system is bigger than any one of you." Her words landed with the weight of a final verdict. It was a challenge, a warning, but it was also a promise, one that Claire knew she would see through. Dorsey's jaw clenched, but before he could fire back, another voice broke through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was deep and calm, but it carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. It was the unmistakable presence of Daniel Harrington, the assistant U.S. attorney. Claire's eyes shifted to Harrington as he entered the room, his gaze sharp and focused. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The officers in the precinct straightened up at his presence, their casual chatter dying off. Harrington had that effect on people. He didn't need to speak loudly to command respect. It came naturally to him, and now it was clear that things were about to change. Claire turned to him, her face still flushed with anger, but now there was a sense of relief as well. The cavalry had arrived. "These officers," she began, her voice trembling with barely contained fury, "arrested my grandfather without cause. They treated him like a criminal, and I demand to know why." Harrington didn't look at Dorsey as he stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of his position. "Where is James Wright?" he asked, his tone cool, but laced with an undeniable edge. Dorsey didn't immediately respond, glancing at his partner, Hill, who was now nervously shifting in his seat. There was no clear answer, and the unease between the officers was palpable. "I'm asking you, officer," Harrington pressed, his voice sharper now. "Where is Justice Wright?" Dorsey hesitated, but his resolve faltered under the pressure of Harrington's gaze. He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable, before muttering under his breath, "In the holding cell." Without another word, Harrington turned to Claire. "Stay here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He then moved toward the hallway, his stride purposeful. The weight of his authority was undeniable, and as he passed the officers, they stepped aside without a word. Claire stood frozen, watching him go, her mind racing. She knew this was the turning point, the moment the system would begin to take notice. As Harrington walked down the hallway, Claire followed at a slight distance, her steps quiet but determined. She wasn't just going to let this slip by. Her grandfather wasn't some helpless old man in the back of a squad car. He was someone who had fought for justice his entire life, and now it was her turn to fight for him. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly as Daniel Harrington made his way toward the holding cells. The precinct, once filled with the comfortable sounds of routine, now felt heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves had begun to understand that something was about to change. Officers glanced up from their desks as Harrington passed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease, but none of them dared to speak. They all knew who he was, the assistant U.S. attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness in the courtroom, a man who could tear apart even the most solid defense with a single, well-placed question. Claire followed closely behind him, her eyes flickering between the officers, each of them avoiding her gaze. She didn't miss the way some of them seemed to shrink in her presence, as though the weight of her words had already begun to sink in. They knew something was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. As Harrington approached the holding cell, his every movement was deliberate, each step a quiet testament to the power he wielded. He paused just outside the door, his hand resting briefly on the cold metal bars, taking in the scene before him. He could hear the muffled voices from inside the cell, but it was the man sitting silently within that caught his attention. James Wright sat still in the dim light, his hands neatly folded in his lap, his posture unbroken. Despite everything that had transpired, there was a calm dignity about him that made it clear he was not a man who could be easily bent by the petty injustices of the world. He wasn't merely waiting for a chance to explain himself. He was waiting for them to understand the magnitude of the mistake they had made. Harrington let out a slow breath, then turned to face the officers who had been standing at the desk. They were still watching, still unsure of what was about to unfold. He didn't need to say anything to them. His presence alone made it clear that the situation had just escalated. He nodded to Claire, and she stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she approached the holding cell. There was no need for words. None of them were needed anymore. Claire had already said everything that needed to be said. "Open the door," Harrington ordered, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Officer Dorsey hesitated for a brief moment, but Hill, his partner, stepped forward to comply. The door to the holding cell swung open with a loud creak, and for the first time James stood from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, his coat brushing against the floor as he adjusted himself. Claire moved quickly to his side, her face softening as she saw her grandfather standing, unbowed, but still very much the man she had always known, calm, composed, and unshaken by the chaos around him. "You're free to go," Harrington said, his voice calm but undeniably commanding. "The officers who arrested you will be held accountable." James didn't smile, but the faintest glimmer of recognition passed through his eyes as he turned to face Dorsey and Hill. The two officers who had made the mistake of assuming his silence meant weakness. There was no anger in James's gaze, no malice, only the quiet understanding that the time had come for them to face the consequences of their actions. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Dorsey muttered under his breath. But it was clear that he had already started to realize the gravity of the situation. The bravado that had once characterized his every movement was fading, replaced by a simmering unease that he couldn't quite shake. James met his eyes directly, his voice unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he replied, his words measured and deliberate. "You made the mistake of assuming I was just another man you could dismiss." Dorsey flinched, and for a moment, James's gaze seemed to pierce through him, exposing the insecurity and arrogance that had led to this entire mess. Hill, standing quietly behind his partner, shifted uncomfortably. It was clear to him now that they were out of their depth. This wasn't just some random person they had detained. This was a man who had spent a lifetime shaping the very laws they were supposed to uphold. Harrington took a step forward, his expression hardening. "You don't get to make these kinds of assumptions, Officer Dorsey. You don't get to treat people like this. You'll both be facing an internal investigation, and I'll make sure that the Department of Justice knows exactly what happened here tonight." Dorsey opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. There was nothing left to say. He had made a mistake. They all had. As James turned to leave the holding cell, Claire walked beside him, her presence a reminder of the power of truth. She had already seen what was coming, and now she could feel the weight of it settling into the air. This wasn't just about her grandfather. This was about the larger fight for justice, the one that would continue long after this night had passed. As they passed the officers who had been standing nearby, Claire felt the shift in the atmosphere. The once casual, confident postures of the officers had evaporated. They stood straighter now, their backs tense, their faces trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was no use. The walls of the precinct had begun to close in on them, and they knew it. James and Claire made their way down the hallway toward the exit, where Harrington had already arranged for them to leave. As they stepped through the doors and into the cool night air, the city felt different. The streets seemed to shimmer with a quiet promise, the lights of the skyline stretching high above them. But even as they walked away from the precinct, James knew that the battle wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The officers who had made this mistake would face the consequences of their actions. But there were deeper, more systemic issues that had to be addressed. This wasn't just about one night or one arrest. It was about years of unchecked power, years of abuses that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. And now those shadows were starting to recede. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. News reporters filled the benches, their cameras flashing every few seconds, while legal analysts whispered into their microphones, their voices steady but filled with a quiet excitement. The case had become one of the most high-profile civil rights cases in years, and now it was time to see how it would unfold. The defendants, officers William Dorsey and Brian Hill, sat at the defendants' table, their backs straight and their eyes forward. But the tension in their postures told a different story. The smirks they had once worn with ease had disappeared, replaced by tight jaws and nervous glances exchanged between them. Their attorneys whispered frantically in their ears, trying to prepare them for what was to come. But it was clear from their expressions, They knew they were already losing. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Claire Wright sat beside her grandfather, James. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the table as she tried to keep her emotions in check. She had seen the way the officers had dismissed her grandfather, but now she was watching them try to defend their actions in front of a judge, and it felt like a battle she couldn't afford to lose. James, seated next to her, was a picture of calm composure. The years of experience in courtrooms, of navigating the intricate world of law, were written into every line of his face. But today, his focus wasn't on himself. Today, he was here to ensure that the truth came to light, that the system that had been so quick to condemn him would be forced to confront its own mistakes. The prosecutor, Daniel Harrington, stood up and approached the witness stand. His movements were deliberate, his eyes never leaving the defendants as he made his way to the front of the courtroom. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and it was clear from his demeanor that he wasn't going to let anything slip through the cracks. "Justice Wright," Harrington began, his voice strong and clear, "I would like to ask you to recount the events of the night you were arrested. Please tell the court what happened." James stood slowly, his every movement a reflection of the years of experience he had navigating this very environment. He adjusted his coat and looked at the jury before turning to face Harrington. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and firm, as if every word he said carried the weight of his career and his honor. "I was standing outside the Hamilton restaurant," James began, his tone calm but filled with the authority that only someone of his stature could command. "I was waiting for my granddaughter. I had no intention of causing trouble, no intention of loitering, but two officers approached me, Officers Dorsey and Hill, and without any provocation or any valid reason, they demanded that I move along." He paused for a moment, his eyes flicking toward Dorsey and Hill, who were now sitting with their heads down, their shoulders tense. He could feel the weight of their presence, but he didn't flinch. He knew what they had done. "I explained to them that I was waiting for my granddaughter," James continued, his voice never wavering, "but they ignored me. Instead, they accused me of suspicious activity, of loitering outside a nice place. They didn't ask for my identification. They didn't listen to my explanation. They simply decided I didn't belong." The courtroom was silent as James's words settled over the room. The officer's attorney stood up, clearly shaken, and tried to interject. "Objection, Your Honor," the attorney said, his voice wavering slightly. "This is merely the testimony of the defendant. There's no evidence to support these claims." The judge, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience on the bench, turned toward the defense attorney. "Sustained," she said simply. "The witness will answer the questions posed to him." Harrington nodded, acknowledging the judge's decision, and turned back to James. "Did they check your identification, Justice Wright?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "No," James replied, his eyes never leaving the officer at the defense table. "They didn't even ask for it. They assumed I was a vagrant, someone who didn't deserve to be standing in that area. And they arrested me, without cause." A low murmur spread through the courtroom, and even the reporters paused to take in the weight of James's words. The defense attorney, who had been so confident moments before, now shifted nervously in his seat. He could see the tide turning. There was no way to dispute the fact that the officers had failed to follow basic procedures. No identification check, no attempt to de-escalate the situation, just assumptions based on the color of James's skin. Harrington turned toward the jury, making a point to pause before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice steady and controlled, "what we are dealing with here is not just a case of mistaken identity, it's a case of racial profiling, of systemic bias that allowed these officers to treat a respected retired Supreme Court justice as a criminal without ever questioning their own assumptions. We are here today not just to seek justice for Justice Wright, but to address the greater issue of how we treat people based on the color of their skin." The defense attorney, visibly rattled, stood up again, but his words lacked the confidence they once had. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice thin. "The prosecutor is making unfounded allegations." The judge didn't even look up from her notes. "Sustained. The jury will disregard the last statement." It was clear that the defense was grasping at straws. There was no way to undo the damage that had been done. The evidence, though not physical, was in the behavior of the officers, in their failure to follow procedure, and in the overwhelming testimony of a man who had seen enough injustice in his lifetime to recognize it when it appeared. Harrington turned back to James, his questions now more focused, more direct. "Justice Wright," he asked, "when you were arrested, were your rights read to you?" "No," James answered flatly. "They never told me why I was being arrested. They never read me my rights. They didn't even check my identification. They simply assumed I was a problem." The courtroom was silent again, and the reality of the situation began to settle in. There was no defense for the officers' actions. They had arrested a man who should have been shown the utmost respect, and they had done so without cause, without justification, and without regard for the law. After a long pause, Harrington turned to face the jury. "We will show you that these officers violated Justice Wright's rights, that they violated his dignity, and that they violated the law. And when we are finished, you will understand that this case is not just about one man, but about the larger issue of how we, as a society, must confront our own biases and prejudices." The judge nodded in agreement, and with that, the case proceeded. The officers, once so confident in their actions, now faced the undeniable weight of their misjudgment. There was no going back now. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the prosecution's case continued to unfold, exposing the full extent of the officers' misconduct. Every word James Wright spoke seemed to cut through the tension in the room, each statement solidifying the case against Dorsey and Hill. The defense team, once confident they could explain away their client's actions, was quickly running out of room to maneuver. The cracks in their argument were widening with every passing moment, and they could feel it. As James finished his testimony, he took his seat beside Claire, his hands once again resting lightly on his lap. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm that was building around him. The officer's attorney stood up, a visible sheen of sweat on his brow as he approached the jury, attempting to salvage what little he could. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney began, his voice faltering slightly, "what we have here is a simple misunderstanding. Officers Dorsey and Hill are hardworking members of the New York Police Department who were simply following protocol. They responded to a situation based on what they perceived at the time as suspicious behavior. There was no ill intent, no malice. But the jury wasn't buying it. Their eyes were focused on James, on the calm, dignified man who had stood for justice his entire career, and then on the two officers who had treated him like a criminal without cause. "Yes," the defense continued, "they may have been mistaken, but their actions were not criminal. They did what any reasonable officer would have done given the circumstances. Officers Dorsey and Hill deserve your understanding, not your condemnation." But the words felt hollow, unconvincing. The defense attorney's voice had started to crack as he spoke, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury could feel the momentum swinging firmly in the prosecution's favor. Harrington rose to his feet, his presence commanding immediate attention. He didn't need to say much. His every movement exuded authority. He walked toward the jury box slowly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began, his voice clear and measured, "what you've just heard is an attempt to justify behavior that cannot and should not be justified. These officers did not make a mistake. They made a choice to treat an elderly man with disrespect, to make assumptions based on his race, to ignore the law, and to arrest a man without cause. They did not follow protocol, they did not follow procedure, and they certainly did not respect the rights of a citizen." Harrington paused, his eyes flickering briefly toward the defense table before returning to the jury. "And now they would like you to believe that they were simply following orders. That is not the truth. The truth is, they acted out of bias. They allowed their prejudice to dictate their actions, and they violated the very principles they swore to uphold when they became officers of the law." The courtroom was silent now, every person hanging on Harrington's words. The defense attorney had no response, his face pale as he sank back into his seat. The judge's eyes were steady, her gaze fixed on the prosecutor as he continued. "This is not just a case of one man being wrongfully arrested. This is about a pattern of behavior that goes unchecked, a pattern that allows men like Dorsey and Hill to believe that they can act with impunity, that they can decide who belongs and who doesn't based on their own biases. This is a moment for all of us to look at the system and ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to live in? One where power is wielded without consequence, or one where justice is truly blind? As Harrington spoke, Claire sat a little taller in her seat. Her grandfather's calm had been a beacon throughout this process, but it was clear now that the prosecution was driving home the point with undeniable clarity. She glanced at her grandfather, and for the first time that day, she saw a glimmer of something more than the usual calm. There was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much larger, something that would have a ripple effect long after this courtroom had emptied. The jury's attention was fixed on Harrington, their faces a mix of disbelief and realization. It was clear they understood now. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a betrayal of the very ideals that had built the nation. Dorsey and Hill had broken the law. They had acted recklessly, assuming that their badge was enough to shield them from the consequences of their actions. The defense tried again, but their arguments were no longer coherent, no longer convincing. They were grasping at straws, their attempts to deflect falling flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. After a brief recess, the trial continued, and it was time for the closing statements. The defense attorney was too worn out to mount a serious defense anymore. He stood up weakly, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his voice lacked conviction. He stumbled through his final remarks, his argument falling apart with every word. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, his tone less confident than before, "our clients are good men. They were just trying to do their jobs. They made a mistake, yes, but they didn't deserve to be treated like criminals for it." The jury sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed on him, but their minds were already made up. The trial had laid bare the truth, and there was no turning back now. Finally, it was James's turn to speak, but he didn't need to say much. His testimony had already spoken volumes. The truth was undeniable. The jury could see the reality of the situation, and they knew what the right decision was. And when the judge called for the verdict, the weight of the moment was heavy in the air. The jury deliberated for only a short time, their decision already clear. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, and for Dorsey and Hill, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. They had thought they were untouchable, that the badge they wore protected them from the consequences of their actions. But now they were being forced to face the reality of their mistakes. The silence that followed was heavy. The officers sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale and their hands trembling slightly. There was nothing left for them to do but accept the inevitable. And for James Wright, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction. The law had been served and justice had been restored. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated by the system. As the judge read out the sentence, Dorsey and Hill were both sentenced to years of probation with mandatory retraining and oversight. But more importantly, they were barred from ever working in law enforcement again. Their careers, once built on the assumption that their authority would never be questioned, were now over. As the officers were led out of the courtroom, their heads hung low, and the reality of their downfall set in. They had been the ones who thought they held the power, but now they were the ones facing the consequences of their own ignorance. James Wright stood tall as he left the courtroom with Claire by his side, his back straight, his posture unbroken. He had fought for justice, and in that moment it had been served. But the fight was far from over. This victory was just the beginning. The courtroom had emptied, and the echoes of the verdict still hung heavy in the air. The journalists who had been present to capture the drama of the trial quickly filed out, their voices buzzing with excitement over the historic case that had just unfolded. But for James Wright and Claire, the weight of the moment didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of a much larger shift. They walked out of the courthouse together, their pace deliberate but measured. James's face was calm as always, his eyes scanning the world around him. But Claire could see the quiet satisfaction in his gaze. He had known this battle would not be won with just one victory, but that it was a step forward in a much larger fight. It was a fight against the biases that ran deep in the system, a fight to ensure that future generations would not have to endure the same kind of injustice that he had faced for so many years. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long shadows over the city streets. The crowd was still gathered around the building, some waiting for a glimpse of the lawyers, others hoping to capture a photo of James, the man who had fought for justice his entire life. Claire felt a surge of pride for her grandfather, but it was tempered by the recognition that this moment, this small victory, wasn't enough. Not yet. "Do you think they get it?" Claire asked, her voice steady, but a hint of concern lingering in her tone. "Do you think the system will actually change because of this?" James turned to her, his expression thoughtful as he watched the crowd disperse, the sounds of the city filling the space between them. "It's a start," he said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of experience. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It never has. It's a long road, Claire. What we did today was one step, but the road ahead is still long, and there's much more work to be done." Claire nodded, her thoughts racing. The trial, the verdict. It had been a significant moment, but it was only the first piece in a much larger puzzle. She had seen firsthand the deep-rooted biases in the system, the way people like her grandfather were too often dismissed, and the way officers like Dorsey and Hill were allowed to act with impunity because of the badge they wore. And now it was clear that this was just the beginning. The system had been forced to reckon with its own failures, but the question was, would it change, or would it continue to protect those who had abused it? That night, as they sat in their hotel room, James received a call. It was Alan Whitmore, the Chief Justice of the United States. James had known Alan for years. He had mentored him, worked alongside him in the courtrooms, and understood him as one of the few men who truly understood the complexities of the law. Alan's voice was calm on the other end, but there was an unmistakable weight in his tone. "James, we've been monitoring the situation closely," Alan began. "What happened in the courtroom today, what happened with Dorsey and Hill, is just the tip of the iceberg. We're moving forward with federal investigations into the NYPD, and not just into these two officers. This is bigger than one precinct, one department. It's systemic." James leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Alan continued. "We've already begun discussions with the Department of Justice. We're going to push for federal oversight of police departments nationwide. It's not just about holding officers accountable, it's about reshaping how the system operates at its core." Claire, sitting across from James, could hear the conversation. She could see her grandfather's calm expression falter for the briefest moment as Alan spoke. It wasn't surprise. James had always known that real change would require more than just a courtroom victory, but the news of federal investigations, of national reform. It felt like the first real glimmer of hope she had seen in years. "Thank you, Alan," James said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever I can to help. It's about time the system was held accountable." After the call ended, James turned to Claire, his gaze thoughtful. "This is bigger than we ever expected, Claire. What we did today, it's going to open doors, but we need to be ready for the fight ahead. The people who benefit from this system won't let it go down without a fight, but we can't stop now. This has to be the beginning of real change." Claire's eyes narrowed with determination. "I know, but we can't stop, can we? Not now." James shook his head slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Not now. Days turned into weeks, and the ripples from the trial began to spread. Federal investigators descended on the NYPD, carefully sifting through records, interviewing officers, and looking into years of complaints that had been swept under the rug. The charges against Dorsey and Hill were just the beginning. The real work was now in uncovering the deeper issues within the police force, within the system itself. The media, once skeptical of the story, now covered every development in the case. News outlets reported on the upcoming investigations, and protests erupted in cities across the country, calling for accountability, for transparency, and for real change. The spotlight was now on the justice system itself, and the pressure was mounting for real reform. James and Claire continued to work tirelessly, speaking at forums, meeting with civil rights activists, and pushing for legislation that would hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. They knew it would take time. Decades of systemic issues could not be undone overnight. But they also knew they had the power to shift the conversation, to force people to confront the uncomfortable truths they had long ignored. It wasn't just about Dorsey and Hill anymore. It was about every officer who had abused their power, every victim whose voice had been silenced, and every citizen who had been forced to live in fear because of the color of their skin. It was about changing the fabric of the system from the inside out. And as the weeks passed, the phone calls, the meetings, and the momentum continued to build. The reform movement was gaining steam, and though there were many battles ahead, for the first time in years, James felt a quiet hope that perhaps, finally, change was possible. As the days turned into months, James continued to work with leaders in the Department of Justice, with activists, and with lawmakers to push for policies that would ensure the kind of oversight that had never existed before. They worked together, tirelessly, to create a framework that would not only hold law enforcement accountable, but also rebuild trust between police departments and the communities they served. And through it all, James Wright remained at the heart of it, a man who had seen firsthand the failure of the system, but who now stood at the forefront of a movement that sought to heal it. Months passed, and the ripples from the trial continued to send shockwaves through the country. James Wright had become more than just a retired Supreme Court justice. He had become a symbol of resilience, a symbol of the fight for justice that stretched far beyond one man's wrongful arrest. And though the public was rallying behind the call for reform, there was still much work to be done. The investigations into the NYPD's practices expanded beyond just the two officers, Dorsey and Hill. As federal investigators combed through years of data, they uncovered a troubling pattern, a history of unchecked power, systemic abuse, and racial profiling that had persisted for decades. The actions of those officers were not an isolated incident. They were part of a culture that had become ingrained in law enforcement. The system as it stood had failed its citizens, especially its most vulnerable. James continued to lend his expertise to the movement. He met with leaders of civil rights organizations, strategized with politicians, and participated in forums where people, sometimes angry, sometimes hopeful, gathered to demand change. He knew that the fight was only just beginning, and that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something new stirring inside him, a sense of hope, however faint, that maybe the world was ready for real change. Claire stood by his side every step of the way, her resolve as strong as ever. She had seen the injustices firsthand, had lived through the struggles of watching her grandfather fight for a system that often seemed designed to protect those who abused their power. But now, watching the tide shift, she knew that they were part of something much larger than themselves. They were part of a movement that would shape the future. One evening, as they sat in their living room, James received a call from Alan Whitmore. Alan's voice, usually calm and measured, carried an unmistakable weight. "James, we've been working behind the scenes for a while now, but it's finally happening," Alan said. "The federal government is moving forward with new legislation aimed at reforming police practices nationwide. We've already seen significant changes in departments across the country, and this is just the beginning." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "I've seen these kinds of promises before, Alan. It's easy to pass laws, but harder to enforce them." Alan's voice was firm, but there was a hint of optimism in it. "This time, we've got the muscle behind it. The public is behind it. The Department of Justice is involved, and the president has pledged full support. The groundwork is in place. Now it's up to us to ensure that the system changes, that accountability is enforced." James nodded, a slow smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's about time." The conversation continued as they discussed the next steps, and James felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. They had won the battle in the courtroom, but the true victory lay in what had happened after. They had pushed the conversation beyond the walls of that one courtroom, beyond one city, and into the halls of power. They had started a movement, and now it was growing, unstoppable. As the weeks turned into months, the legislation began to take shape. Police departments across the country were forced to implement new practices, mandatory body cameras for officers, the establishment of independent oversight committees, and a restructuring of police training programs to address issues of racial bias and accountability. The Justice Department took a more active role in monitoring police behavior, and cities that had once been plagued by police violence began to see changes. albeit small ones at first. But James knew that this fight would never truly end. Real change took time, and the system was stubborn in its ways. He wasn't naive enough to think that a few new laws would suddenly erase the deep-rooted issues within the justice system. But he also knew that every victory, every step forward, mattered. It mattered for the people who had been silenced, for the families who had been torn apart, for the communities that had long been ignored. And most importantly, it mattered for the generations to come, who would inherit a justice system that, despite its flaws, would strive to be better. One evening, as James and Claire sat together on the porch of their home, the city lights twinkling in the distance, James looked at his granddaughter with quiet pride. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined, Claire," he said, his voice soft. "This fight, it's ours now, and it's bigger than both of us. I'm proud of you." Claire smiled, her eyes bright with the knowledge that the work they had begun was just the start of something much greater. "We're not done yet," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot." James reached over and squeezed her hand. We're not. The movement for justice was no longer just an idea. It was a living, breathing entity, growing stronger with every challenge, every victory, and every setback. The battle was far from over, but James Wright knew that the fight had been worth it. Because at the end of the day, justice wasn't about a single victory. It was about making sure that the laws we live by upheld the dignity of every individual, regardless of their race, their background, or their place in the world. And as the sun set over the horizon, James knew that they had started something that would change the world for the better, a movement that could never be undone.